Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Friday, October 20th, 2017. As we record our daily news and comment podcast, we're feeding it live on Facebook video from the secret studio here in the Bay Area of California. It's been quite a week for us here in California and also for the nation as a whole. In a moment, I'll update you a little bit on the wine country fires and some of the controversial posts with a lot of speculation, much of it with which I find way off base, that I've been seeing on Facebook all week long. And I invite you to call in and comment. You can agree with me or disagree. That's the whole idea. This is just like talk radio. Yeah. Except we're doing it on Facebook, and I don't need a transmitter. There is no geographical limitation. People can call in from across the country or even in other parts of the world. And the number to use, if you'd like to comment on the show today, is 415-455-0102. That's 415-455-0102. Now, the story that was launched by Trump on Monday at a hastily called news conference, when he defensively responded to a question from a reporter about what he had done regarding the 4 American troops who were killed about 2 weeks ago in Niger, the geographically massive nation in Africa. And all week long, as this story has compounded through the bungling efforts of the Trump administration and the fact that a congresswoman from Florida who was in the car and heard on the speakerphone the gaffe-ridden call that Trump made trying to console the widow of a soldier as they were driving to the Miami airport to claim his body. It is offensive on so many levels. But before we dive into that political scrum, I want to compliment Rachel Maddow. I want to compliment the White House reporters and the PBS NewsHour, who finally on Thursday thought to ask the question, what the fuck are those guys doing there, and why were they vulnerable to be killed? And it's a very defensive response from the Trump White House and from the Pentagon. And Rachel Maddow, to her credit, did not open her show last night with the latest part of her telenovela about Russia meddling in our election. She gave a full 20 minutes or so to exploring the background of why President Obama committed troops to that region in 2013. We still don't really have a clear sense of their mission or what legal authority under congressional war powers those troops were dispatched there. And we know even less about the skirmish that led to the deaths of these 4 troops. And the man in question, LaDavid Johnson, whose wife got the condolence call from Trump after he bragged that he'd called everybody in that category, every family that had lost a soldier. Well, if Rachel's reporting is accurate, and I have no reason to challenge it, she said that the U.S. troops had been basically advising troops from the nation of Chad. Chad shares a lengthy border with Niger. And as a result of the Trump travel ban 3.0, which gratuitously, it's believed, added Chad to the list of nations where its citizens cannot currently travel to the United States, the nation of Chad pulled its troops from the joint operations with the United States. Now, you can imagine that the Trump White House does not want to believe that its ill-advised efforts to pull up the drawbridge for Fortress America and claim that people coming from majority Muslim nations cannot enter here because they're all terrorists and they would all threaten the security of American communities. You can imagine that they don't want that aired out. They don't want to examine that, and it helps explain why when he was asked why the troops died, Trump turned the conversation to condolence efforts, whether it's a letter or a phone call, and then said that he's done much better than Obama and Bush did in this regard. Now, this is the way Trump operates. He is obsessive, he's compulsive about always being number one, always being the best, grading himself a 10 on Puerto Rico. We'll get to that in a moment. But we deserve to know why American troops are in Africa. What is the mission? When will we declare victory? And what is the exit strategy for these troops? And as this controversy boiled and boiled over this week, and then John Kelly put it into a pressure cooker, if we're going to use the same metaphor, it took the media until Thursday to scratch their heads and say, I wonder why these men lost their lives. And why did Sergeant Johnson get separated from the others? Why did a separate search and rescue operation have to be undertaken to collect his body? These are all legitimate questions, and the Trump administration is not interested in answering. Over at the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Mad Dog Mattis said U.S. military leaders like to know what we're talking about before we talk. We don't have all the accurate information yet. Well, it's been 2 weeks. Can't they issue a preliminary report? Now, according to BuzzFeed, the U.S. military believes the ambush was likely carried out by an ISIS affiliate called ISIS in the Greater Sahara, one of several affiliates operating in the region. The group has attacked French counterterrorism forces in the past, but this is their first attack on Americans. And as I mentioned, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson's cadaver was found 2 days later. On Thursday, a spokesman would only say that he was separated. It is still not clear how and when he was killed, why he was left in the aftermath of the firefight. Was he tortured or disfigured because his wife was told that he must have a closed casket funeral? And let's be accurate here. The U.S. military has been in Niger since 2013. We currently have about 800 troops in the country, according to the Pentagon, and we've just built a $100 million base for surveillance drones in central Niger in the town or province of Agadez. That's the most we know, and we deserve to know a lot more. Now, General Kelly had garnered widespread respect, not really for the months that he ran the Department of Homeland Security, but when he came to the White House, he was seen as the adult running the daycare center, as Senator Bob Corker has referred to it. And many people felt that, despite any misgivings they might have, that Kelly and Mattis and General McMaster, who runs the National Security Council, that these are the cool heads who've kept Trump from pushing the button to launch missiles on North Korea, for example. But General Kelly showed himself as a demagogue yesterday and a political actor of the lowest order. And he, who had refused to exploit his son's death in combat in Afghanistan, exploited his son's death in combat in Afghanistan with a heavy dose of misdirection. Because General Kelly lashed out at Congresswoman Frederica Wilson of Florida, an African-American woman who sports fancy clothes and always wears a cowboy hat. And she's drawn a lot of racist ridicule that I've seen in social media over the past few days. They don't care what her comments were, why she was in the limousine going to the airport to help collect the body. She's a friend of the family. And when Trump made the call, after bragging that he always calls, and he's called every family of a fallen soldier, the widow put the call on speakerphone. And General Kelly attacked Congresswoman Wilson for listening in on a private call. And then she corrected the record and explained what Trump had actually said. And in his comments in the press room yesterday, Kelly did offer some background. And we can infer that at some point Trump said, hey, I'm going to call this widow. What should I say? And Kelly, who explained to the press that when he learned of his own son's combat death, the military official who knocked on his door told him that his son was doing exactly what he wanted to do when he was killed. He knew what he was getting into by joining the 1% of the Marine Corps. He knew what the possibilities were because we were at war. Now, that's Kelly's comment. But as it came out of Trump's mouth, it turned into a garbled gaffe that was seen as highly insensitive by the family and by Congresswoman Wilson, who would not be silent and who will not be silenced. And so today, because in his final remarks before he left the press room, Kelly added a gratuitous comment about his presence with the former FBI Director Comey and Congresswoman Wilson and others at a ribbon-cutting ceremony at a federal building in Miami. And he falsely said, this is now proven by videotape. Kelly said he was there, and he heard the Congresswoman claim that she had secured the funding for the building when she wasn't even in Congress at the time the money was appropriated, and that she instead took credit, if you want to call it that, for securing the names on the building, the names of the FBI officers who were killed. And Kelly, who twisted that into an attack on Congresswoman Wilson, to my knowledge, has yet to apologize, and she fired back today. She said, he can't just go on TV and lie on me. I wasn't even in Congress in 2009 when the money for the building was secured. How dare he? She said. Now, this is like a soap opera. The he said, she said, the back and forth. And then today, in what has become a pattern for the guy with the bad comb-over, Trump having gotten Kelly to take a bullet for him, to try to clean up the mess that Trump had made, Trump then tweets a contradiction. Now, it wasn't specific to Kelly or Kelly's comments, but he said the fake news is going crazy with wacky Congresswoman Wilson, who was secretly on a very personal call and gave a total lie on content. Now, this is like Jeff Sessions trying to, with a straight face, tell everybody that Trump had fired Comey because of the way he handled the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and then Trump went out and told Lester Holt from NBC, nah, it was because of the Russia investigation. And so now General Kelly, who put himself and his credibility on the line, well, he has now been undercut by the president, who he loyally tried to defend. And this is the lesson. Trump is loyal to absolutely no one. And whether it's his inability to control himself, his attention deficit problem, he will throw anybody under any bus at any time if he thinks it suits his purposes. Now, if you're watching on Facebook, we've got about 10 people I see viewing on the screen right now, and I want to invite you to share this feed on your Facebook links to put it out to your network of friends and admirers. And I invite you to call in today. My topic A is about the speculation that I've seen in various Facebook posts about the cause of the wildfires in the wine country here in California. Now, last night we got the first rain of the season. Oh, it was delicious. I slept really well. It has a beautiful, non-addictive narcotic effect. And it came as great relief to the residents of the wine country, many of whom are back in their homes, many of whom remain in shelters, some of whom can't go home because their houses are gone. And I want to share with you some of the comments that I got when I posted this as a topic last night. One, Achille, says, I'm a conspiracy buff, and I'm still evacuated. I think the space lasers theory is batshit insane. I hike these hills all the time, and I know the conditions were ripe for something like this. Plus, the same fire pattern has happened at least twice before, in 1964 and, I think, 1927. PG&E, that's our rogue utility here, is quite happy for you to blame space lasers, however. Paul Anderson, who I've worked with in the past, he posted PG&E, why complicate things? And Pam posted Breitbart claims it was an illegal immigrant who started the fire. And that story has been aggressively knocked down by the sheriff of Sonoma County. So I'm opening up my phone lines, and I'd like to hear from you. Have you read some of these posts? Are you persuaded by them? And yesterday, I recorded an in-depth conversation with Mickey Huff. He is the director of Project Censored at Sonoma State University, which was evacuated for a week or more because of the firestorms that were plaguing the area. Here's the latest edition of Project Censored. And Project Censored's whole goal is to expose the news stories that the mainstream media has either downplayed or ignored in the previous year. And Mickey Huff has an excellent bullshit detector. He doesn't swallow official narratives just because they come from the government. And he always looks for evidence, even evidence coming from alternative sources, to get to the truth of a given story. And I want to play this excerpt from my conversation with Mickey Huff and invite you to call and share your views today, because he points out that there is a big difference between asking questions and drawing conclusions when the evidence is not yet available.
I think that when we don't know exactly what's going on in a catastrophic situation, it's not abnormal to have people speculate and theorize and ask important questions and look for contradictory evidence coming from official sources. But at the beginning of any kind of a tragedy, it's not abnormal at all, also, to hear conflicting accounts, because people are trying to sort out what's actually going on and separate rumor from fact. Mark Crispin Miller, who's a good friend of ours and wrote the foreword to our 2017 anniversary book, did post a few of these speculative theories for contemplation. Mark did not say one way or the other if he thought that this is in fact what was happening.
That's correct.
But he was sharing that information as part of that process, right? And I also looked into, in fact, I'm glad you ran, that was an incredible rundown, that menu you just gave, because now I don't have to say any I don't have to go and rehash any of those. So kudos for that coverage. I looked at almost every one of the things that you had mentioned, and possibly another two others. But the directed energy weapons, the geoengineering, the weaponized weather, I mean, again, let's be real. Some of this stuff there is factual evidence for in other historic situations, particularly with weather mod, geoengineering, and these kind of things. But I'm not talking about that now, because there's no evidence of that going on here. And I think that's where we need to be focusing ourselves, is where is the evidence? What do we know?
Where is the evidence and what do we know? I've got a caller on the line. Let's see who it is and what they have to say. Good afternoon. You're on the Peter B. Collins podcast.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
Yeah, this is not directly related to the fires that are happening now, but kind of related. And I know you're in the Bay Area, so you're probably familiar with the Ghost Ship fire that happened almost last year now.
Right.
But I come from the 9/11 Truth Movement. I've been looking at this stuff for a long time, and I am troubled by sort of this increasing mindset of people jumping to conclusions right away instead of just asking questions. And one of the most, I guess, troubling examples of this for me was right like the day after the Ghost Ship fire, which killed 3 of my friends. There were people in the event page for the Ghost Ship fire and videos already being made within 24 hours saying that it was a false flag attack, a human sacrifice, satanic sacrifice of some kind, and then even people saying that nobody died. And actually on the event page there were people trying to convince people who had lost loved ones that nobody had actually died and they were still alive. And it's very troubling, and I just thought I would share that because, as someone who comes from sort of a conspiracy world, there's definitely a line, that I tried not to cross, or just in general in my research.
What's your first name, please?
Oh, Robbie.
Hi, Robbie. Well, let me just add that in one of my posts that started with an exchange with Mickey Huff, I put that I'm about to take off my tinfoil hat because I challenge the narrative of 9/11. I always have. Most recently, I challenged the official reporting on the Las Vegas massacre. And in between, I've challenged the FBI on its frame-up of so-called domestic terrorism suspects and many other issues. And I use alternate news sources and people who I trust and find credible. But the wave of speculation about the green blob, about directed energy weapons, claims of that are asserted, not just offered as a possibility, that directed energy weapons or military-grade accelerants were used. It really exposes the ignorance of the people who claim that they know, that they have received sufficient proof to support the claims that they're making. And I just want to run down for you and for our listeners and viewers a list I made of some of the obvious factors that contributed to the conditions that created this massive firestorm. I mentioned that last night was the first real rain that we've had since the last rainy season ended in April. And because we had an end to the drought, there were massive amounts of fuel that were generated. We then had a really extreme heat on 3 different waves, including most recently around Labor Day, when temperatures in San Francisco were over 105 degrees, and anybody who's been here knows that that never happens, okay? Yeah. Then we look at the fact that there are over 100 million dead trees across California, mostly related to the drought. And in today's San Francisco Chronicle, they cite a UC Berkeley expert on trees who estimates that 30% of the trees sampled in the fire zones in Sonoma County were afflicted with sudden oak syndrome. I had a tree on my property with sudden oak that died, and it died in phases, and the internal part of the tree, basically imploded before the exterior. And there are these fascinating pictures, right, of a tree that the bark and the main part of the trunk are not on fire, but through knots you can see that there is a raging fire glowing inside. And people seize on that and say, well, that can only be military-grade accelerants. Well, excuse me. The fuel that was available for this fire, the fact that the community of Coffee Park in Santa Rosa that did burn all the way to the ground had much lower fire standards in the building code because it wasn't expected to be a hazardous area. And as I recounted from some of the Facebook posts, the most likely culprit here is what I call the rogue utility Pacific Gas and Electric. They have a lengthy history, for example, of executives who are in charge of the tree trimming program pocketing bonuses for cutting back on the tree trimming program. They have a lengthy history, and in fact, they have been convicted on a criminal basis in federal court of negligence for the firestorm in San Bruno that was caused by gas pipelines that PG&E didn't even have maps of. And that revealed that they don't know where many of their gas pipelines are. And so, I'm open to all kinds of possibilities. But when people start to claim that the Islamic State, George Soros, the UN Agenda 21, and then this ICE agent comes out and says, it was started by an arsonist who's an undocumented immigrant, they're exploring the possibility of arson. But so far, there really isn't anything to report on that. So we have a lot of people who are promoting pre-embraced agendas, whether it's the ICE guy who wants to turn this into a sanctuary state criticism, or people who believe that chemtrails or the HARP program were used to decimate the communities in Napa and Sonoma County. And as a truther, as somebody who does stick my neck out on a regular basis to challenge official narratives, I just find this really infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like there was a period of time, maybe like around 2005, 2006, where there seemed to be a separation between these sort of the very wild, speculative, conclusion-jumping stuff versus like the more grounded conspiracy stuff. And I feel like those two worlds have merged in a pretty toxic way where, conspiracy theorizing in general has become more mainstream, And it almost, I mean, it is mostly conclusion jumping stuff. I mean, even in the wake of the Las Vegas shooting, I had a hard time finding things that, were credible sort of alternate research projects versus ones that were just conclusion jumping.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of still trying to dig through that.
Well, Robbie, let me recommend, if you go to my podcast from yesterday, and click on the show file at peterbcollins.com, follow the link in the very last story, because it takes you to a very interesting YouTube video. And the individual who presents, I don't have his name right in front of me, but he calls himself the Health Ranger. And he presents as a guy who, his business is the forensic acoustics of the use of firearms. He also says that he is a long-range target shooter. And he presents a very clear theory that is based on the recordings of the gunshots in Las Vegas. And he concludes that there was a second shooter coming from a position other than the hotel room where Stephen Paddock was reported to be. So this is, I think this is information that people deserve to have. The corporate media is at least acknowledging the shifting timeline in Las Vegas. Both the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times have reported on that in the past week. And they raise questions about the security guard, Jesus Campos, who was going to do some interviews, then disappeared, then resurfaced for a softball interview with a companion minder on the Ellen DeGeneres show earlier this week. So, there are very legitimate questions to be raised, but there is overwhelming circumstantial evidence related to geography, the drought, the onshore winds that are called Diablos in Northern California that were blowing in with 2% humidity on the night of the fire. That means it was hot and dry. And also these theories about various vortices, that's the plural of vortex, that were created as the wind whipped through and around structures that caught fire. And so I am open to a full investigation. I believe that PG&E will be held culpable for downed power lines that they say were rated at for hurricane conditions. But the unhinged speculation, and let me single out one of my Facebook friends. On Saturday night, I responded to her, and this is a woman who is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, all right? And she posts on a daily basis all kinds of things about sensational stuff. She comes from the right, but I don't hold that against her. And when I asked her to please stop posting these speculative items, and in particular, she had put up a post from a local news outlet about some arson suspects, and it made it look like these were arson suspects for the current fires. These were people who were arrested near Santa Rosa in early September. So it had no possible relation to the current fires. And when I asked her not to do it and challenged her on her facts, she fired back and basically said that she specializes in sensational stories and that it's basically her constitutional right to do that. And she closed by telling me that I should F off. So I just feel that this has gone too far. And I'm releasing the interview with Mickey Huff. It'll be up just about as soon as I finish the live video feed here on Facebook today. And I encourage people to listen. Mickey and I don't see eye to eye 100%, for example, on the wind speeds, but we certainly identify the history of PG&E that makes them a very likely culprit as the origin of these fires. So, Robbie, anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, I guess the only thing that you brought up PG&E that I wanted to add is I live in a area with a lot of hills, and I mean, basically PG&E will ask you if you want to bury the power line that you have to pay for it yourself. I mean, the power lines up where I live are so precarious and basically weaving in and out of so many dense trees that it's basically a disaster waiting to happen. And I mean, I think it's pretty likely that if the power line fell or something like that, I mean, it's very likely that they're culpable. So I guess that's all I'll say, and thank you for having me on, Peter.
Okay, Robbie, I appreciate the call. I've got lines open if you'd like to join in and share a comment, and push back if you don't agree with me. It's okay. I'd like to hear from you at 415-455-0102. And my friends over at the Citizens for Legitimate Government, who post interesting articles and alternative media sources on a regular basis, they're right in the thick of this. Let me read a headline. Evidence of military-grade EMF accelerants used in Sonoma Napa fires. Next headline, proof California fires started by HARP matches. There is no proof of that. You can say, you speculate, you can ask the question, but anybody who says they have proof at this point, they're full of it. Good afternoon. You're on the Peter B. Collins podcast. Who's this?
Hey, great. Hey, Peter, it's Ford.
Hi, Ford.
Hey, man, how you doing?
I'm great. I'm glad to have you calling in. What's on your mind?
So what's on my mind first, addressing the ludicrous explanations for the fire, that seems silly to me. What was most, or has been most salient, was Peter Fimwright's article in the San Francisco Chronicle yesterday, I think, where he analyzed the phenomenon of these incredible wind and fire vortices that happen all over Sonoma County. That was the result of sustained 50 to 70 mile-an-hour winds, and as you mentioned earlier, huge amounts of dry tinder, which then ignite, and the heat rising creates these vortexes where the fire essentially goes horizontally, and that's what he was talking about impacted I forget the neighborhood in Santa Rosa. I think it was Chaffee or Chafee, the one that
Coffee Park.
Yeah, Coffee Park that got hammered the hardest. So while PG&E is an easy scapegoat and an easy mark, and no doubt is likely by lack of maintenance to have some play in the causation, I think it's more the environmental factors. And the thing that I was hoping to maybe talk with you about more and shift the conversation is to prevention and to whether or not, and really to advocate that serious and controlled burns be conducted, which haven't been conducted before because of the inherent, probably European fear of fire. For example, where you live, up on the side of Baldy, has got a huge amount of tinder in those forests. And
we have a lot of eucalyptus trees that are extremely dangerous.
Those are really dangerous because they have a really high oil content and they explode. But it's the stuff that it doesn't get up into the ukes because their branches are high up. It doesn't get into the ukes unless you have the sub-level of tinder and duff and all kinds of dry, dead branches and fallen trees ready to go off. And all over Marin, I mean, we're lucky in Marin that this hasn't happened to us yet, and it's going to. We're not going to get a pass on these disasters forever, and we're right. And there should be, and I'm hoping to generate more public discussion about prophylactic measures that are effective. I mean, some, for example, Larry Bragman in the Marin Municipal Water District Board has advocated goats and animals that eat like levels of broom, but they don't deal with the dry tinder, the kindling, basically, that's ready to go off. So those are really my comments.
Well, and I just want to loop back to the ukes for 1 minute because Kyle just posted that he agrees eucalyptus trees are mighty dangerous. And here's Jake saying especially exploding eucalyptus trees. My house was threatened by a fire uphill from us. This was 20 years ago. And at that time, there was a grove of almost a dozen 100-foot eucalyptus trees. Now, fortunately, in the intervening years, a new neighbor bought that house and voluntarily took out all the trees. But before he did that, we talked to PG&E, we talked to the county, we talked to our insurance company, we talked to our neighbor's insurance company, and nobody would, preemptively take out the trees. They said, well, if they burn and your house burns down, we'll reimburse you. And, we were not obviously satisfied with that. But these areas, and I'm just using the eucalyptus trees as one example, you're correct. There are many other sources of fuel, and we really need to get a handle on this, and as a community, come together and prioritize fire prevention tactics before the next big, onshore wind-driven firestorm arrives.
That's right, before it's too late.
Yeah. Ford, thanks for the call.
Okay, bye-bye. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, good to have you listening, too. And Ford is an attorney, by the way. He certainly knows what he's talking about. I welcome your calls. I'm going to continue my news and comment here. But if anybody else wants to remark on this, feel free to give us a buzz. I do agree with Ford that the graphics that were in the San Francisco Chronicle yesterday are very interesting. I held them up to the camera, not sure anybody was actually able to see them in detail, but you could find that at sfchronicle.com. And I think it is worth looking at, particularly if you live outside the California area and you'd like to learn more about these unique conditions. Now, speaking of disasters, Puerto Rico is still on its knees. Very few people have electricity, and the grid and the generators were so devastated that it's reported that it will take months to restore power across the island. That didn't stop Trump from grandstanding with the kiss-ass governor of Puerto Rico who came in on his knees. I don't know if you saw the pictures, but he was sporting a tie that went all the way down to his crotch, just so he could be like Trump. And maybe he thought that was going to help them bond and that Trump would, relent on his hard line toward Puerto Rico, who, is being given payday loans to help rebuild, where Texas and Florida are being given massive cash grants from FEMA. And the scrappy mayor of San Juan, who has been in Trump's face, and deservedly, she responded today to Trump's claim that his administration deserved a grade of 10 out of 10 for his handling of the hurricane relief. She said, well, if it's a 10 out of scale of 100, of course, I could agree with that, and that's still a failing grade. She went on to say, I think the president lives in an alternative reality world, that only he believes the things he is saying. But certainly people are still without electricity. We knew it was going to take a long time for that to happen, but the basic services are still not there yet, and there doesn't seem to be any indication of how it's supposed to go. You can hardly give anybody a 10 when conditions remain that bad. And in the Gulf Coast, one of the hardest hit towns was Dickinson. And yesterday it was revealed that when people apply for financial assistance to help with hurricane recovery, they are required to sign an agreement promising not to boycott Israel. Now, this is part of the insidious pattern of laws that have been passed at the behest of the Zionist lobby in this country, and it is insidious. California has a law. Earlier this week, I told you about the courageous teacher in Kansas who is challenging. She's not only being asked to promise not to boycott Israel, she has to affirmatively state that she has not and will not under the language of the law in Kansas. And this is something we really need to pay attention to. It is clearly unconstitutional. The ACLU has entered the case in Texas, but it's part of a state law that was passed earlier this year, and there are quite a few of them out there. Now, this week I kind of ignored Richard Spencer's appearance at the University of Florida because it's just another provocation where they're claiming free speech rights in an effort to provoke a confrontation and generate news. Well, as a result of Spencer's speech, two brothers and a friend from Texas who had traveled to Gainesville, Florida, to piss some people off, that was their own comment, they got involved in an altercation. Apparently, one of the protesters hit their vehicle because they had been driving by screaming Heil Hitler and other slogans. So a protester smacked their vehicle with a baton, and then the car stopped and these three guys got out, and one of them pulled a gun. Two brothers whose last name is Fears, Colton Fears and William Fears, along with their buddy Tyler Tenbrink, they got out to confront the crowd, and Tenbrink, who has a criminal record, pulled a pistol, fired a bullet, missing a victim and hitting the building behind that person. The three men then got back in the car and fled. They have been picked up. They're charged with attempted murder. And Colton Fears was quoted by a media outlet here. I'm looking at this on Vice News. He's from Pasadena, Texas. He said he traveled there because he's a white male who's been demonized for being a white male. In Charlottesville, I was covered in hydrochloric acid just for being white. They said, fuck white supremacy, and poured hydrochloric acid over me. And Fears also said that Richard Spencer is so powerful he sounds like he's writing a book when he talks. But his brother William Fears said he and Colton had come to Gainesville because they wanted to trigger people, piss people off. Isn't that lovely? And, of course, Trump has no responsibility for triggering any of this. In St. Louis, you may not have noticed, but there have been protests almost daily for over a month regarding civil rights, some of it related to Ferguson, the nearby community. And the acting police chief in St. Louis has been very aggressive, arrogant, and confrontational with the protesters. The city has had to spend $3 million on police overtime, and this interim police chief, whose name is Lawrence O'Toole, has made comments like, we own the streets, and, really been, he has been operating in the context of contempt for the people who he is supposed to be serving. And remains to be seen whether the new mayor there, who has appointed him the interim chief, will sack him. And speaking of contempt, the judge who convicted and sentenced Sheriff Joe Arpaio for contempt of court for his repeated and outrageous failures to honor court orders related to racial profiling of Latinos in the community, she has ruled that despite the pardon that has been issued by Trump, that his conviction will remain on the record. Quote, in her statement, the judge, her name I think is Susan Bolton, she said that a presidential pardon exempts him from punishment, but not his conviction. It does not erase a judgment of conviction or its underlying legal and factual findings. Well, I think that's accurate. And Joe Arpaio was in California this week at a Republican fundraiser. I think it was in Fresno. And Steve Bannon is headlining. He is the keynote speaker for the California State Republican Convention being held this weekend. There's a new study regarding the impact of body cams worn by police officers. A previous study had shown that behavior was moderated, particularly in terms of, breaking the law, abusing people who are either suspects or in custody or just in contact with a cop. Well, over the last 7 months, about 1,000 police officers in Washington, D.C. were issued body cams, and a control group of about the same size was not given body cams. And the results show that there was no large-scale behavioral change in the attitudes of the police. And while you may find this disappointing, I'm not that surprised. One of the things I want to point out that I learned from serving on a jury here earlier this year is that body cams and other police video devices are a rich source of evidence used against suspects. Excuse me just a sec. In the case that I sat in the jury box for, a man was accused of evading the highway patrol, and we spent much of the court session watching videos of this guy on a motorcycle escaping from the cops. Well, the Republicans in the Senate united long enough to pass a phony budget bill. And the main reason for it is a couple of lines in the bill that authorizes a committee to, quote, come up with changes in laws that would increase the deficit. Pardon me. The smoke really aggravated my cough this week. And here I am live on video, so you can all watch it. Anyway, let me quote this again. A committee will come up with changes in laws within its jurisdiction that would increase the deficit by not more than $1.5 trillion. And let me translate this for you. The Republicans had hoped to fund massive tax cuts, mostly for corporations and rich people, by stealing it from Obamacare. And that didn't work out. So now they're just going to add to the deficit. And these are the same people who argued that Obama was profligate and that he ran up the deficit, he risked the future of our country, all that stuff. And they're all silent on that. They're also silent on the terms of the tax cuts that they're considering. We saw a memo come from the White House, but we've yet to see the work of any committee detailing exactly which taxes will be cut. We expect it to remain secret until they pop the bill and try to ram it through sometime later this fall. The efforts to scuttle Obamacare have already had a measurable impact. A new study shows that at least 3.5 million Americans have stopped getting health insurance coverage this year. Now, some of that is because of uncertainty about the future of the Affordable Care Act, and some related to the increased costs that have occurred in many states as the Republicans have publicly tried to kill Obamacare. Over at BuzzFeed, a good enterprise story from our friend Jason Leopold and a colleague, Zara Hergy, indicating that BP, the company responsible for the biggest oil spill in, I believe, world history, but at least in American history, the Deepwater Horizon blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, they are now facing 27 accidents that have occurred at their facilities in Alaska just this year. On September 10th, one example, 2 workers responding to faulty equipment at a drill site inadvertently triggered a leak of 1,200 kilos of gas, one of several serious accidents that are just being reported for the first time now by BuzzFeed. And they say this shows that BP Alaska officials know there's a safety problem. They're desperately trying to clean it up. In fact, they did a stand down. They shut down their facilities for 2 weeks, well, actually the first 12 days of October, to retrain some of their employees in safety measures. Now, I'm glad there hasn't been anything serious so far, but you really can't trust these operators to protect the environment or not to take risks that could cause another huge blowout. It's been a bloody week in Afghanistan where we're fighting the whatever war. And I refer to it that way because Americans don't give a shit. It's been 16 years. And because we have fewer troops there, somewhere south of 15,000 now, most people just say, who cares, whatever. 2 incidents this week. An Afghan army unit in the south in Kandahar was almost completely wiped out on Thursday when the Taliban attack used a series of vehicles loaded with explosives. At least 43 soldiers were killed, and out of a unit of 60, only 2 remained unhurt. Well, I'm going to stop coughing at you and wrap up the podcast here today. I have a couple more stories, but we'll save them for next week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.